right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve, I have another microsynthesis Viewmaster edition, and we're going to focus on the recent TikTok ban debate. And I got a very interesting angle that I'm going to take with this one that I think is going to keep kids popping in their seats. So real quickly here, why do I do microsynthesis? In my 20 plus years of the classroom, I'm a slow learner, and I came to the following conclusion. If I hurl a former exam at them early in the academic year, I'm giving them a culminating experience when they're not ready yet for it. So I think for students, especially my struggling and emerging writers, if I hurl 6 sources at them that are pretty substantive and pithy, I'm setting them up for success. So what we're going to do with this microsynthesis Viewmaster edition is this. All the sources, they're going to come from students. They're going to make the sources, but they have to fit in a Viewmaster slide. That might make no sense to you whatsoever. Not a problem. Saddle in and I'll show you through it step by step. Before I go any further, please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Sprinkle a little love on that bell and spread the word far and wide to colleagues, friends, and students so that I can help beat this pesky algorithm and get my content to as many people as possible. As far as all the sources that you're going to see in this forthcoming presentation, every single slide is nicely compacted into a Google slide down below. Just look in the video description. So all the sources, all the writing workshop exemplars and models that my students wrote and that I wrote are conveniently located for you down below. So have at it. They are for free. So I kind of already alluded to this a little bit, but it's a student-generated prompt creator, what I have going on here. My students and I followed the pattern of a bunch of former exams, and I did this for my 11 region students. So the 11th graders in New York State have to sit for a Regents exam. It's a state exam, and on there we have synthesis, and then I also teach AP language, and of course they have FRQ1 to tussle with. So what we did was just study a whole bunch of former exams, and we're using the language of those former exams to create our prompts for this TikTok assignment. So without further ado, let's see what we got here. So it says the Supreme Court heard arguments on 11025 on whether to overturn or delay a law that could lead to a ban on TikTok in the US in the coming days. The law requires the widely popular app to cut ties with its China-based parent company due to perceived national security issues, or lose access to app stores and web hosting services in the US. So together, I created this with my students. I really helped them get the wording of this exact and perfect. So it goes on. While many perceive the app to be a direct threat to American democracy, Senator Bernie Sanders testified that TikTok should be banned because it poses a grave and immediate danger to the well-being and safety of our nation's teenagers. All right, so that's the crux of the problem there. Are we going to agree with Sanders, or are we going to just disagree with Sanders, or are we going to qualify Sanders? And then the rest of this is just common fodder prompt creation from the College Board. I could have used the New York State prompts as well. In my district, we have required course assessments, and we have tons of synthesis material. So I could have used any old prompt ending that I wanted to, but I went with FRQ1 from the College Board. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on whether or not you agree or disagree with Senator Sanders' assertion. All right, I love that prompt. I think we nailed it in terms of the wording. So it sets students up nicely to agree, disagree, or qualify, which are the rhetorical strategies that we want them to be able to wield for synthesis. So earlier I talked about how we create the sources. And here are the guidelines that I have for the 6 sources. And mind you, I worked with students together in doing this, but they did the bulk of the heavy lifting. So they are granted 1 Canva slide per source, and all of the slides that you're seeing here have been built in Canva. Kids can have free access to that, to the limited version of it, and that's all we have at our school. So 100-word limit if they're using text per source. They can use video clips. There's a ton of stuff on YouTube about this, and my students tend to gravitate there. So video clips have to be less than 3 minutes. Graphs, charts, graphics work really well. And then the kicker on this is to get multiple perspectives. And this is where I really needed to be the teacher in the room and say, hey, that's great. You got 6 sources, but they're all pretty much saying the exact same thing. And it's espousing your thesis already. So at some point in time, you're going to need to get to concessions and rebuttals and that type of rhetorical stuff. So you probably want to have some differing points of view in there. So I've already talked about this as well. You got to Bob Ross your instruction for this. And I did a lot of it with my students. So I wrote introductions with them. I wrote body paragraphs. I helped them gather their sources. I helped get all the language very steady in that. So without further ado, let's take a look at source 1. It's entitled The 10 Most Dangerous TikTok Trends of All Time. And we chose trend number 3, the fire challenge, and just took an excerpt from an article for that. Source number 2 is slap a teacher challenge. I don't know if teachers remember this from a year ago. Each month of the year was a challenge, and I think it was November of last year was slap a teacher challenge, and we kind of had some issues of that at our school, unfortunately. So this one is just a clip about the 18-year-old student in Louisiana that was arrested for battering her 64-year-old disabled teacher. And there is video of that. And I know some districts may block it. My district is fine with that. So the video is there if you want to see that as well. But there's plenty of information just in this little soundbite here in terms of the text. Source 3, new study warns about the impact of TikTok on adolescents, and it comes from Good Morning America. This is under 3 minutes long, and there's plenty of good information in there. Source 4 is back to text. Again, we need some opposing viewpoints. So this one says the surprising benefits of TikToks for teenagers. And there's an associate professor, Jess McLean, that had a fantastic article that goes over several of the benefits and the pros of teenagers using TikTok, which was pretty fascinating. Moving on to source number 5. University of Minnesota study reveals TikTok's negative impact on mental health, but then we combat that with number 6 that says teens turning to TikTok for mental health advice. So they kind of counterbalance each other out. And that's what I mean when we build the sources. They got to be talking to each other in the essay. So you don't want one leaning too far in favor of saying yes, ban it, or one leaning, too far in the no, don't ban it. So good variety. My students did a good job there. So the question becomes, all right, because we're going to write this essay together. How do I write the introductory paragraph? As always, I use heuristics, and I use my declarative thesis heuristic and my inverted thesis heuristic. If you declare, you begin with the thesis. So students can come right out of the gate and say, Bernie Sanders is 100% correct. TikTok needs to be banned. Or what a moronic assertion Bernie Sanders made. Of course, TikTok should not be banned. And it's as simple as that. Just come out with a forthright declarative thesis. From there, you got to get into context and background. This is going to be a 4-paragraph essay. And in terms of context and background, I explain it this way because it seems to make more sense to kids. You have to set your GPS. You have to give your reader a roadmap and a compass. And in the introductory paragraph, I like it when students hint where the two body paragraphs are going to go. And I like it that done that way because it helps students sustain a cogent line of reasoning much better than if they go with other heuristics or templates for their introductory paragraphs. I find this works really, really well to keep things nice and logical and rational. So you want to hint, kind of set the directionality of the GPS in that introductory paragraph. We are writing an academic paper, so I would like to see some tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. Sentence constructs. Those that are familiar with my work know that I love me some Strunk and White, and they wrote the Elements of Style, and the textbook that I use is called Write It Right. Rule number 18 in Write It Right makes the assertion that there's 12 types. 12 sentence types, but we can go further with that and even go so far as saying that there's 20 sentence patterns. So there's 12 types and 20 patterns. Struggling and emerging writers often will overuse one pattern, the independent clause or the short, simple declarative sentence. And in terms of establishing voice, rhythm, and flow, they don't, because it sounds like da-da, 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 da-da. They just stack those independent clauses atop each other. So I'm going to teach my students how to use a variety of sentence constructs in order to achieve optimal voice, rhythm, and flow. So that takes care of the declarative, and I should say this, it's going to be 4 sentences long. No more, no less, exactly 4 sentences long. So 4-paragraph essay, and the intro is 4 sentences. We can flip it on its head and go the inverted route. And in this case, you just end with the thesis. And you're going to say the exact same things, like, beyond a shove it out, TikTok should be banned already. Right? And then you're going to set the GPS, tier 2, sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences. That might be rather pie in the sky and nebulous for some of you. So we'll unpack it. We'll take a look at 4 exemplars that my students wrote in just a second. But before my students begin, I really get on them about knowing their direction. You have to know where those 2 body paragraphs are going before you write your introduction. Otherwise, you're going to take your reader on a rather wayward excursion. Things are going to get pretty discursive quick, and you might get lost in your own thoughts. So we got to make sure we know our direction. Here's exemplar number 1. I'll read it from top to bottom, and then we'll unpack it together. Whether one wants to admit it or not, the adults of this world have a foremost responsibility to protect their young. But unfortunately, far too many leaders have abdicated their roles and surrendered their parenting rights to an electronic app that causes more harm than good. Clearly, there are far too many teens who are trespassing into dangerous territory and need more support and guidance. Given the emerging mental health epidemic among teens, to steering kids toward choosing what is morally correct behavior, TikTok must be banned immediately. All right, so when I grade papers, I do this. I say, I spy with my little eye the thesis. And then I go looking in there and ka-ching, last sentence right here is the thesis. TikTok must be banned immediately. So that's the thesis. I then go look for the GPS settings. And it's very clearly articulated in this one. One body paragraph has to be about teenagers not making good choices. So they talk about moral behavior, morally correct behavior, right? The app doing more harm than good, kids trespassing into dangerous territory. So that's going to be one. And then they talk about the mental health epidemic as well. So that's going to be the other body paragraph. So that's what we mean by setting the GPS. As far as tier 2 level vocabulary goes, there's some nice verbiage in here. Foremost, abdicated is really nice. Trespassing. I even like the word emerging in territory, epidemic. So kids don't want to geek out too much. Like I think they sound too nerdy if they espouse the idea that if you use a million dollar words, somehow you are doing good writing. You have to disabuse some of your students of that when you get into the invitation for them to increase and augment their vocab. So some of them got to peg it back a little bit. And then in terms of sentence constructs, this is what I advise my students. Look at sentence number 1, then write number sentence 2. Sentence 2 should be stylistically different than sentence 1, and 3 should be different than 2, and 4 from 3. That's kind of a surefire way to make sure that you got better voice rhythm and flow, and that you're avoiding that pitfall of independent clause, short simple declarative, independent clause, short simple declarative. And this one has very nice voice rhythm and flow. It does it all. That's the total package right there. That one's perfectly executed inverted thesis. Let's do it again, because that might be a little confusing. And again, it's vital, imperative that students know their direction before they write. So here's student sample number 2. Since its release nationwide in 2016, TikTok has created a young citizenry that is not only more civically aware, but a youth that has its finger on the pulse of our country's world standing. Sure, like anything else in this world, kids overindulge and misuse the app. But this begs the question, should we in turn ban things like candy, which is the leading cause of cavities, just because a few people lack discretion? Clearly, the likes of the Bernie Sanders of the world are being overly alarmist and dramatic. TikTok should not be banned. All right. I spy with my little eye another inverted thesis. TikTok should not be banned. Very, very clear, very clearly asserted there. In terms of GPS, I think the directionality of this is very clear, right? Just because some kids are harming themselves with this app and engaging in behaviors that are not, good. We also have things like candy. It causes some health issues for kids, cavities, obesity, malnutrition. So do we ban candy? No. So you just put safeguards in measure and make sure that, the adults of the world are enabling kids to make better choices around that. So that's where the body paragraphs are going to go for this particular paper. So teachers and students, you might be sitting there saying, I can't do that, Kristian. That's crazy hard. But you can. It takes practice. So my students have been doing this all academic year, and we are in January at the time of recording. So they've had plenty of practice with me. We've been doing this from day 1. So here's exemplar number 3. This is not an all or nothing proposition. Yes, far too many teens are falling into abysmal rabbit holes of making poor life decisions because of their TikTok usage. So one body paragraph has to talk about that. But by no stretch of the imagination whatsoever does this necessitate the total banishment of the app. Instead, safety measures need to be set up into place to steer kids in the right direction. And that is the other direction that it's going to go. So this is a qualifier. And I like this one a lot because I think most of my students are not so black and white with this issue. They have TikTok, they use it, they see the pros and cons of it. And, a pure banishment of it doesn't seem quite rational for a lot of my students, and they did qualifiers. So if your students want to qualify, or if you are a student watching this, this is how you would do it. All right, good place in the video to hit the pause button and give it a whirl. Students, try it. Declare, invert, say pro, say nay, qualify, have at it. Teachers that are watching, it's always a good idea for students to see student writing. I think the more writing a student sees, the better they become. I'm a huge philosophical proponent of that. Students need to see students writing. So what I do is I pause here and I have students write, and then I just have a couple of kids share theirs on the overhead and we break it down together. And as the student is breaking theirs down, the big learning piece that I like is that the student explains their directionality. That's a really difficult concept to teach, and some kids don't get it. They're so accustomed to writing without knowing their direction that when I ask them to, they have a hard time doing so. So it's pretty cool to have students explain their own writing and then to get the feedback from their peers as well. So here is one more student example, just so that you can see it one more time. It seems to be that the likes of the Bernie Sanders of this world are the only sensible adults willing to step to the plate for teens. So this is hinting towards a declarative. Not only is there a mental health crisis raging among teens, so one paragraph is going to talk about that, which can be solely traced to this app, but we have a nation of kids making entirely careless and dangerous decisions because of the inherent dangers of peer pressure. Body paragraph 2 goes that direction. Something needs to happen and happen sooner than later. Unquestionably, banning TikTok is a step in the right direction. So teachers and students, you might be seeing a pattern here. Most of my students found it easier to invert. It's kind of like you need a little bit of context and background before you clobber somebody with a thesis in this particular paper. So I would say 9 out of 10 of my student samples ended up inverting instead of declaring. I don't know why. It just happened with this particular prompt, but that's the benefit of giving kids options. And they made intelligent choices, and the inverted, I think, just flowed a little better than the declarative. So the question becomes, how do I write the body paragraphs? We got a lot of white paper left, a lot of white space. So intros are done. We got to figure out how to do the body paragraphs. Easy peasy, and many of you are familiar with my work. You know that my students use a heuristic known as the syllogistic method. It comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle thunked it up. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and like us composition teachers, he was principally concerned with establishing cogent lines of reasoning. So he made this quasi-mathematical formula that proceeds from premise 1, premise 2 to conclusion. And if you put all the mathematical parts in there, you will yield something that's supremely logical. So I'll give you an example. If I say arsenic is deadly in the first premise, and then I provide a little bit of textual support to it, and I say, yep, walked into the kitchen this morning, made a cup of coffee, and there's Snickers. He's underneath the kitchen sink, and I say, Snickers, and he pulls out, and he's got white stuff all over his muzzle and his grizzle, and I'm like, oh, no, I put arsenic beneath the kitchen sink because we have a rat infestation problem. You all at home right now are saying to yourselves, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die, right? That's logic. Either we're going to induce or deduce, right? We're going to be logical. Aristotle coined the word cogent, and being cogent just means that you have a tight, strictly adhered to line of reasoning. So how do we take this heuristic and morph it into something for the benefits of writing a synthesis paper? Easy peasy yet again. First premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So up top in the introduction, we just said ban it, don't ban it, or qualify it. We didn't really get into our whys. So this area of the paper, the first premise, is going to be our why reason. There's some math to my heuristics. So we know 4-paragraph essay, 4 sentences for the intro. The first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. Here's the reason why. On all those synthesis prompts, whether they be for the College Board, the Regents exams, the exam in California, the exam in Massachusetts, it doesn't matter. They all say something closely akin to this, if not this verbatim. Your argument must be central. To keep the argument central, you can't have quotes and paraphrases. You can't have any mention of the source material at all in those first 3 sentences. It's just the student and his or her argument. That's it, their why reason. So we're going to start quoting and paraphrasing in the 4th sentence, which is where the second premise begins. And then we have to be mindful that paragraphs need conclusions as well, because oftentimes students will slap a quote and then poof, they're out of that paragraph. And we're like, no, get back here. You aborted mission too soon. So we got to make sure that we have a first premise, a second premise, and a conclusion. Last piece of math on this. a syllogistic body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences long. So I know earlier when I said that we were only going to do 4 paragraphs, I know some of you were probably thinking, but Kristian, all essays are 5 paragraphs long. Nope, nope, nope. If you're writing body paragraphs that are like 4, 5, 6 sentences long, yeah, you're probably going to need that third body paragraph, but you're going to probably break your line of reasoning and be a little discursive. If you give students the space of 10 to 12 sentences, they have plenty of playing field for a line of reasoning and plenty of space to flesh out an argument really fully and cohesively. So let's break this down bit by bit. We'll ask ourselves the question, how do I write a first premise? And I got a couple of stems that I like to use. Early in the year, and especially with my struggling and emerging writers, they tend to like these. You can say there is a clear reason as to why, if you have a singular reason, or you can say there are a couple of reasons why, if you have a couple of reasons. And here's the kicker with this. By virtue of saying reason why, by default, verbally, linguistically, you will drop your reason why. You will articulate your reason why. It's really hard for some reason to get kids to articulate a reason why. And again, early in the year, I make my students use these stems until they can take them away and stand on their own. So if this is your first crack at using my heuristics, you might want to begin here. Your more advanced, comfortable, sophisticated writers, they can say, nah, I don't need it, and just move on. So let's see an entire 3-sentence first premise with the stem. There is one principal reason as to why TikTok should not be banned. It is only a problem for a select few demographics. Instead of safeguarding all teens from something that only harms a few, simple measures can be taken. A first sensible step is a user agreement policy that must be enforced uniformly across the board. All right, very cool here. I like that. That's worded nicely. And when I read first premises, I say this to the kids all the time. What is the promise of your first premise? Because a line of reasoning is kind of like a promise. This student is promising that they're going to talk about a user agreement that must be enforced and clearly articulated to every user of the platform. And if there's any violation whatsoever, then the kibosh needs to come down. Right? The hammer needs to be dropped on that particular teenager and they're off the platform, or there's a system of, penalties, like a first infraction, second infraction, third infraction, something of that nature. So that's a very clearly articulated why reason, and they got there via the stem. So let's recap this here. First premise, 3 sentences, argue the why reason. At the end of the first premise, you have to ask yourself, what's the promise of the first premise? And then you have to go get all your quotes and paraphrases that are germane and linked to the promise of the first premise. That's a guaranteed way to make sure that the line of reasoning stays intact. First premise, confusing. I know. I'm going to show you 2 more because kids trip up here, and if the essay is going to fall apart, it's usually in the first premise. It's because of a poorly phrased or ill-schemed first premise. So here's another one without stems. Unfortunately, teenagers are like lemmings and will blindly conform to whatever the current trend might be. Whether it be a piece of clothing apparel, slapping a teacher, or trashing a school bathroom, far too many kids lack the wherewithal to exercise restraint and rational thinking when making critical decisions. As such, one must take a good look at the pros and cons of banning TikTok. So what are we going to talk about here as far as the promise of the first premise? Conformity, those frontal lobes. Sometimes kids just follow the masses and they're lemmings and they do things that they ordinarily would not do, but these things become trends. And that's what this student is promising to talk about here. And then they're going to have to talk about initiatives in the second premise, either to ban TikTok, keep it as it is, or modify it. Again, not an all or nothing proposition. So in fact, this kid went on to qualify it. and talk about how there needs to be user agreement policies and things of that nature. So again, you got to get into what's the promise of the first premise, and then go cherry pick all the quotes and paraphrases that are germane and linked and relevant to the promise of the first premise. Let's see it one more time, one more first premise, and then we'll transition into the rest of the body paragraph. There's one common thread in the last 4 major school shootings. The perpetrators were all influenced and encouraged to act out their heinous crimes from the TikTok app. Not only is this appalling, but it is preventable. Clearly, just in order to put a halt to these atrocities, the app must go. What's the promise of the first premise? We're going to talk about the last 4 school shootings. That's it. And how TikTok influenced those. That's it. So you go and get all your quotes. You go quote hunting, you go paraphrase hunting, and you have to talk about what you promised about in that first premise. And that will be your support and analysis for the second premise, and basically the bulk of the body paragraph. So let's transition to the 4th sentence, which is the second premise. And I tell my students in the 4th sentence, I like to see quotes and paraphrases. So usually when I'm modeling for them, I'll quote. I'll get right into the sources. So you can see their first 3 sentences, which equal the first premise. All 3 examples we looked at don't even mention the sources, right? It's you, your argument. You are staying central. You don't want to bring anyone else into the picture. So 4th sentence is where we're going to do that. In a recent interview with Good Morning America, Susan Smithers asserted that apps like TikTok are an existential threat to the safety and well-being of teens, given the pull that underdeveloped frontal lobes have toward mass conformity. Source 3. All right, very cool here. So let me talk about a couple of things that are going on in this 4th sentence. One, I hear with my ear that is a pretty smoothly embedded quote. I don't hear any abrupt quote transitions. There is one more piece of math that helps us with quote transitions. It's called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational, but you'll see here that you're going to have to use brackets. And I use 2 of them here in this quote. As we proceed through the rest of the syllogism, note those brackets and those parentheticals. Those 2 techniques, the bracket and the parentheses, help kids stay conversational, and that needs to be explicitly taught. So we quoted. What do? We have to analyze the quote. We have to put it into our own words. So look at the transition here. Within this line of thinking, and you got to ask yourself, what line of thinking? The line of thinking in the quote that we just quoted. So I love teaching my students some stems like that, some transitions out of quotes, just to ensure that they are analyzing their quotes. Within this line of thinking rests one simple truth. Being a teenager is a bit like playing a game of monkey see, monkey do. Unfortunately, and perhaps one can chalk it up to a lack of experience or immaturity, but far too many teens lack the cognitive capacities to discern right from wrong when confronted with the allure of succumbing to peer pressure. And that comes from source 5. So we've got 2 sources in here. One other piece of math that I'll throw at you. I like it when my students use a total of 3 citations in a syllogistic body paragraph. Synthesis, by definition, is a pluralistic word. So if they're only quoting or paraphrasing once, they're really not synthesizing. 2 is a minimum expectation, and 3 gets them truly synthesizing. I'm out of space in this slide, so I'm going to go on to the next, right? We quoted, we got to analyze. Take, as a clear case in point, the 10 most dangerous TikTok trends like the penny challenge. Back in the autumn of 2024, a trend emerged which saw teenagers placing pennies between plug-in devices and the actual outlet. In brief, this would cause an electrical fire in most instances. James Cook, a sophomore in rural Illinois, followed the trend, which witnessed the total destruction of his school and the killing of 14 of his peers plus 3 teachers. Source 1. So now we got 3 sources going together. And look at that. All three sources are talking to each other. They build upon each other. They hold hands. They're singing in unison with each other. So we got a source here. We just paraphrased it, right? So you can do a blend of quoting and paraphrasing. So we quoted twice. We paraphrased once. We're good. Whether it be trends like this or dares like slap a teacher month, far too many teenagers lack the discernment to make the best choice. All right. We got to tag a conclusion on this. We're not done yet. We got to go full circle back to the prompt and the thesis. So look at this. Clearly, the adults in these kids' world need to do more to protect them. As such, Bernie Sanders is correct in the following assertion. TikTok must be banned for the good of all. Do you see how we got back to the prompt and to the thesis? Those conclusions usually take 2 sentences, sometimes 3 sentences. If a kid's quick, they can probably do it in 1 as well. And in total, you got yourself 12 sentences there for this syllogistic body paragraph. Very cool. Line of reasoning stayed supremely intact on that. Nothing superfluous came in. We didn't get waylaid. We didn't get distracted. So we just stayed course on that. So intro's done. First body paragraph's done. We ask ourselves the question, what do I do next? Boom! It's easy. Bust out another syllogism. It's a 4-paragraph essay. Usually in the second body, I like to do my rebuttals and my concessions in that space. That's how I teach my students to do it. And I'll give you an example of a first premise that sets you up for that. So here it is. But there's also a differing perspective on the issue that must be acknowledged and addressed. So that nod of the head. One can easily concede to the fact that there is a teenage mental health crisis, but one must also note that TikTok has benefited a lot of youth, both socially and interpersonally. It's not an all or nothing proposition, but there are unquestionably more elements of good than bad. All right, what's the promise of the first premise? We're going to talk about some of the bad stuff that TikTok has going on in it as far as mental health goes. But we're also going to talk about the good and how it outweighs the bad so that students and teenagers can grow interpersonally and socially via the app. So where do we go from here? 4th sentence, we got that second premise. You got to keep the promise of the first premise and all that stuff we just talked about. You got to go get quotes and paraphrases for that. So teachers, if your kids are really, really struggling or you want an easy exercise for them, have them take that first premise that I just wrote there and have them go get the quotes and the paraphrases for it, right? You got to make sure you get those lined up before the line of reasoning takes shape, and then they can flesh out the entire syllogism. So that takes care of intro, body 1, body 2. We got to wrap the essay up with a conclusion paragraph, and I like conclusion stems early in the year. And some of my students hold on to these for the whole academic year. But basically, I equate the conclusion of an essay to a fireworks display, the grand finale. We're encapsulating, we're talking all-encompassing theme and exigence. So when you're coming full circle, you might want to say things like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done. At the end of the day, and in doing so, you might have one that looks like this. Again, last piece of math. Usually conclusion paragraphs are 3 to 4 sentences. In no other words, we need more Bernie Sanders of the world stepping up to the plate for teenagers. Not only are we under assault by the likes of TikTok, but we are pleading for help. Adults need to do what they are here for, adult and lead the young back to safety. And that'd be a whole essay right there. That'd be a darn good essay if our kids could do that. So hoping your kids can dig in and geek out with this TikTok topic. And happy trails, happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reasons, I can be reached at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I love to hear from teachers and students. I think it's just wonderful. I've heard from teachers and students all over the world since I launched my YouTube channel, and what a collaborative community, and I'm blessed to be able to help teachers and students out. So don't hesitate. You can always send me an email if you want to. Also note that I do a ton of professional development throughout the calendar year, and I call it Teach It Right PD sessions. So I travel. I can come to your school district and work with your department or a handful of teachers there. I also do one-on-one PD, and we typically do this through Zoom, where I can work with you one-on-one if you want to augment your compositional teaching skills and all things ELA. I also have a self-paced course, which is the bomb. A lot of teachers really love this self-paced course. It's inexpensive and it guides you through everything that I do as a teacher, from my Word Study Academy to my Nuance Academy. There's tons of supports and tons of content in there in that self-paced course. So you can get information on all those PD sessions at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. And upon scrolling through that stuff, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. That's it for now. I'll do some more microsynthesis in the coming days. I'm going to tackle energy drinks next, whether or not to have a drinking age for them, like a 21 drinking age, or to ban them in total. So that'll get kids' ears peaked. So take care, be well, and I hope you enjoyed this one.